Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this first meeting after the introductory study, in-depth analysis and commentary on apocalypse and priestly action. Let us begin with the commentary on the first lecture, briefly revisiting some of the aspects we touched upon in the previous lecture. After the fire, the Holocaust of the First Gothianum in 1922, straddling 1923, and after the Christmas conference of 1923-24, we find ourselves today in the rhythm of those years because we're about a century later. Steiner speaks to the priests of the movement for religious renewal, that is, the Christengemeinschaft, the Christian community, founded in 1922 by Friedrich Rittelmeyer with his disciples and priests. In these lectures, Steiner does not speak, if you remember, as a founder of the Christian community, but as an initiate who transmitted the renewal of the sacramental impulse, and on the basis of a question that had been asked of him, and being an initiate responsible for the questions that are asked of him, because the questions that are asked of an initiate are, we can say, doors or windows, if we want to imagine them, that open wide onto the spiritual worlds. The initiate receiving this opportunity to translate a question into an answer through the perception of the supersensible worlds, imagination, inspiration, and intuition, when he receives a question and when he can give the answer, he must do it. The only case in which an initiate can, so to speak, not answer a question is if this question has not been asked from the heart in sincerity and devotion, but has instead been asked out of curiosity. In that case, even if the initiate is able to peer into the spiritual worlds, to perceive the answer in the spiritual worlds, in fact, no new door, no new window open in the supersensible worlds, and he rather renounces this answer. But that is really the only case. So the only case is if the question itself has a flaw. It can be curiosity, it can also be, for example, a malicious intent, an insincere motive with respect to the formulation of the question itself, a question that is not disinterested, that has selfish interests behind. While in the case of a question that is asked and can be answered, this opens up new dimensions of spiritual worlds so that an initiate, faced with this sincerity, cannot fail to respond. Steiner gives this sacramental impulse of renewal so that the Christian priesthood, thus renewed, can regain a cosmic dimension in which the current of Abel, which is the priestly current, can harmonize with the current of Cain, which is the royal current. Looking at the two aspects of these two currents, we could also call them the esoteric current of that of Cain, while that of Abel is exoteric. Everything that Steiner brings us here is based on the fact, as Steiner states, that for humanity today the tasks are once again great. Steiner announces that humanity is facing a phase in which the divine spiritual impulses no longer act directly through the ancient mysteries. So the divinity does not reveal itself directly in the mysteries as it did in the primordial past of humanity. Rather, these mysteries must pass through man itself, freed in its consciousness soul. The mysteries need to rise again from within man itself, from the free and conscious participation that is brought into being by man in the mystery cult. Therefore, the divine spiritual world works indirectly through human consciousness, as if it were waiting for human consciousness to recognize its role as a collaborator of the divine spiritual world, and it keeps waiting for this awakening on the part of human beings. Thus, contemporary modern man is called to become a conscious instrument of the renewed mysteries, of the new mysteries, through the sacrifice of the I, a sacrifice that takes place within, in the innermost part of the human being, because it is precisely this sacrifice of the selfish part of what we call the I that makes the place where the renewed cult is practiced in the sense a temple. This new mystery is precisely the sacrifice of the innermost part of man, of the selfish part of man's innermost being, which then, in this giving of itself, in this sacrificial act of selfishness, opens itself once again to participation in the divine spiritual world. The divine spiritual world awaits us, so to speak. It awaits this inner realization of man, and when man achieves it, then it opens up wide. Steiner refers to the need for something that is more than intellectual understanding. We can indeed strive intellectually to understand it, but this is not enough. Because what is sufficient in itself for worship and therefore transcends knowledge and intellectual understanding is the act itself, the cultic act itself. The giving of the whole human being in sacrifice of the inner life of the human being in its egoistic aspect. Thus, the transformation of the sacrifices of the ancient mysteries which took place in the ancient temples into a new sacrifice is announced. It starts from the I of the human being. This, in the Christian community, in the way Steiner will renew the Christian cult, is the act of consecration of the human being. This act, which is placed, we might say, at the heart of the Christian community, is for Steiner the renewal of the Christic mysteries for the present time on the path of Abel. A path of Abel that welcomes the renewing solar impulse from the Kenite current offered by Steiner, that is, Antroposofia. So, Antroposofia is received by Steiner, and Steiner gives this impulse to the Christian community. Steiner acts as a conduit for a question that was asked by Rittelmeyer and his disciples, so that the spiritual world, the being of Antroposofia in particular, can give this answer. He acts as a translator, so to speak. As Steiner tells us, the movement of the Christian community originated in Germany, but he also prophesies its future expansion. Why? Because, in fact, Rudolf Steiner, as he has told us on several occasions, knows perfectly well that in the transition from the 4th to the 5th and 6th cultural epochs, what will happen is that organized religions will gradually disappear, leaving behind forms that are emptied and have already been emptied of meaning, and will progressively become more and more empty, leaving only the forms. What must happen, therefore, is that when human beings awaken to this active relationship with the spiritual world, in this sacrifice of their egoistic part, in order to reopen their relationship with the spiritual world, what happens is that they must welcome the esoteric impulse that comes from the Cain stream. So only with the solar Cainite impulse can the Abbolite lunar religious form now be renewed and revitalized in forms that would otherwise remain mere external form. Thus, from this request, this question that was formulated to Steiner, this movement arose in Germany, and we can say more broadly in German-speaking countries, Germany in the sense of the German language. But it will expand as it has actually done. Let's always bear in mind, however, that Steiner says that the Christian community, like any other form of organized religion, even though the Christian community has elements that make it entirely capable of understanding what modern man is, remains an initiative within the path of Abel. Consequently, what will happen? That even the Christian community will move towards the preparation of souls who, in the course of incarnations from the 5th to the 6th epoch, will join the Cain current. So, what is Steiner telling us, and rightly so? He's telling us that all religious forms will gradually dissolve, even those that today have, so to speak, the impulse to move towards the Cainite stream. This because the souls that will be part of it are, through this impulse, preparing to reincarnate, to unite completely with the Cainite impulse. All Abbolite impulses will gradually disappear as we move towards the 6th and 7th cultural epochs. Even those who have accepted the Cainite impulse, indeed, these will be the ones who prepare the souls that have joined to move towards the Cainite impulse in the course of various incarnations. New religious forms will appear, and this will culminate in what is known as the true Christianity of the 6th cultural epoch, brought by the Maitreya Buddha, who is the master who will appear in the 6th cultural epoch and bring Christianity to its peak. But when this culmination occurs, Christianity will cease to be a religion and will instead become an active force in human society, in the relationships with human communities and between human individuals. What does this mean? It means that as we move from the 6th to the 7th epoch, only the Cainite impulse will remain. Steiner will also refer to this form of true Christianity as Christosophia, and it is the true Christianity that the Templars worked towards in advance, as did other movements after the mystery of Golgotha. The Church of John the Evangelist itself already brought forces towards this. In sum, all these efforts derive from the Church of John. What will happen is that it will become a moral force acting in humanity. It will no longer be an external form, but a force arising from within the human being. The culminant representative of this process is the Maitreya Buddha, whom Steiner will call, just as Christ Jesus is the Word made flesh, the Word Christ who became flesh in Jesus of Nazareth, so will the Maitreya Buddha be the flesh-made Word. From there, all organized religions will essentially be dissolved, only deteriorated forms will remain. Purely external forms, emptied of spirituality and indeed filled with false prophets, will in fact be beings of obstacles, exploiting the ancient form of religious aggregation to create what we see today in its early stages, a false religion that we now call scientism, the religion of science. This will then have undergone transformations and will be a true religion of man merging with the machine. What today, with the philosophical approach, is called transhumanism, with different approaches. You must imagine that Steiner carries out this act of renewal of the Christian community, of this religious impulse, while at the same time dissociating himself from it as its founder. He's not the founder, he's a conduit for this renewal and envisions that it will expand and allow for gradual transition towards the sixth epoch with the arrival of Maitreya Buddha. The same applies to all other anthroposophical social initiatives. Other branches, such as the tree articulation as well as the ward of school, also have this very intention of bringing prepared souls to the sixth cultural epoch so that they can recognize Maitreya Buddha when it appears. Incidentally, for those who may not already know, given that we are just a few days away from his feast day, this Maitreya Buddha, whom you may have already heard about in other seminars we have held, is the individuality we call Saint Francis of Assisi, who will return in the sixth epoch of culture and then will indeed be Maitreya Buddha. He's preparing for this metamorphosis. Steiner then says that this Christian community has a universal inclination. It is a completely renewed Christianity that was founded in the freedom of the consciousness soul, and for this reason, just like anthroposophical spiritual science itself, has a universal rather than a national character. The impulse of the consciousness soul, even more so in the epoch of Michael, is a cosmopolitan impulse that wants to overcome national boundaries and blood brotherhood. All such evolutionary impulses, the Christian community in this case, but in a broader sense, the anthroposophical spiritual science, as well as the whole impulse of the path of Michael, and therefore also the Rosicrucians, have a cosmopolitan intent, going beyond the national element and leading humanity to overcome blood brotherhood and reach the sixth cultural epoch, the broader brotherhood of spirit. Steiner then recalls the fact that the first celebration of the act of consecration of man took place in a place very close to the point where the flames were unleashed that destroyed the first Gothianum in a Holocaust. And indeed, the cause of this, the one who lit this fire, had been sent by a collusion of the forces of obstacles, as we discussed last time. Those who had offered themselves to these forces of obstacles. In particular, we called these two forces the Jesuit impulse and the deviant Masonic impulse. These two forces, one is the degenerate Abel current, which is Jesuitism, and the other is the degenerate Cain current, which is decadent or degenerate Freemasonry, by joining forces wanted to destroy the building where the union of these two currents took place in order to inaugurate in a regular manner, i.e., without wanting to appropriate the powers that spring from them, precisely the union of the Cain current and the Abel current. And Steiner says that we can imagine this fire of the first Gothianum not only in a destructive sense, but also as a sacrificial purification. In the face of events, we must see that there are destructive aspects, but also creative ones, always. The fire that burned the first Gothianum in Holocaust also delivered it to the spiritual worlds. Everything that is burned in the fire passes into the spiritual worlds. Consequently, a true mystery of the first Gothianum, of this Holocaust of the first Gothianum, takes place, which is also the mystery of man. Through fire, the ancient wooden temple is thus transformed into the spiritual temple of man, and this fire is precisely the fire of the eye. Fire which was originally present in the sacrifices of the ancient mysteries, and what was burned in the fire was sacrificed and delivered to the spiritual worlds. Today, this fire burns in man, and it is its eye. that with enthusiasm can sacrifice itself in its egoistic aspect in order to unite with the spiritual worlds. The new Goetheanum, the second Goetheanum in Rudolf Steiner's initial intentions, which then did not come to pass, represents in fact a body where the union of Cain and Abel can be celebrated anew. At the time Steiner was still alive, that is why I say he wanted to assign to the second Goetheanum the same purpose of uniting the currents of Cain and Abel. But we know very well that, unfortunately, after Rudolf Steiner crossed the threshold, the more Abelite and the more Cainite currents, or if we want to put it another way, the more Platonic and the more Aristotelian currents within the Anthroposophical Society itself did not agree, and this led to the elimination of the esoteric core of the Anthroposophical Society itself. This happened in the years following Rudolf Steiner's death. We will not go into detail here, but what happened? While the first Goetheanum was, if you look at it in its form, the image of the human brain, the large dome with the cerebellum, the small dome, if we superimpose the silhouette of the first Goetheanum on that of the second, we see that the second is a skull. It has the shape of a human skull, completely enclosing the shape of the first Goetheanum. So the first Goetheanum becomes an etheric brain that is delivered to the spiritual worlds through sacrifice and fire. And the second Goetheanum, which was supposed to preserve with its form the first supersensible Goetheanum, is in fact deprived of what is ideally, to have an image, the central commissure, the place where the right and left hemispheres of this etheric brain, which is supersensible, which is the first Goetheanum, are joined together. This juncture is the heart, the esoteric section of the Anthroposophical Society. Steiner's intention was to recreate a temple of new mysteries, the first Goetheanum and also the second, but unfortunately this did not happen. So this series of lectures by Steiner, as the title itself suggests, aims to relate the apocalypse of Joan to priestly action, and in particular will always have as its backdrop the act of consecration of man. Since this is the foundation of the Christian community, and since these lectures were given only to the priests of the Christian community, as we might say the first seminar of the Christian community, and to what was then the leadership of Goetheanum. Why this relationship between the apocalypse of Joan and the act of consecration of man? Because the apocalypse is the initiatory text par excellence of esoteric Christianity, written by the hand of the greatest Christian initiate himself, or Christic initiate, if you want to use a term that perhaps suits us better, who is John the Evangelist, Lazarus resurrected, who takes the name of John the Evangelist, the same author of the Gospel of John. With the Gospel of John and the Apocalypse, the Church of John is established, as I mentioned earlier, which will be the foundation of all the spiritual movements working for the sixth cultural epoch, to reach the time when the flesh will become the Word, when the Maitreya Buddha will appear and give new indications on how to recognize the Christ after our fifth epoch. Christianity itself will reach its peak, becoming this moral force that acts in communities. The Church of John operated in particular within the Templars, and then after the end of the Templars and also the end of the Cathars, these forces passed into the Rosicrucians. From the Rosicrucians, with their various transformations, they then passed to anthroposophical spiritual science. All this while gradually fertilizing other branches of Western esotericism. Thus, The Apocalypse is this initiatory text par excellence of esoteric Christianity, and it starts with a recapitulation of the mysteries of the past and, through the impulse of the Christ, arrives at the mysteries of the future, what we usually call the Apocalypse. But in fact, Apocalypse means revelation. So the entire path of Christ in earthly and cosmic becoming is revealed. On the other hand, the act of consecration of man, or more generally the renewal of the mysteries, is the fertilization of the cult of man by a solar impulse, an ancient cult that is renewed through the solar forces. Thus, in the act of consecration of man is manifested what the disciple of Christian esotericism offers as a sacrifice of his innermost being to the apocalyptic light of the Christ, the desire to move towards the future, not to return to the past, to the brotherhood of blood, but to move towards the brotherhood of spirit. Not to shut ourselves up in nationalism and in the lack of understanding that a human spirit lives in every human being. And we will see this aspect as it will be further discussed in this cycle. So, we must always approach the other by recognizing the human being as an incarnated spirit, but also by becoming aware of the action of the spirits of obstacles within reality, and that therefore there are human beings who are also vehicles for the spirits of obstacles. The possibility of recognizing in full consciousness the unfolding of the mystery of man, that man can become more than itself, we could say angelic, or instead can degenerate, become less than itself, filled with spirits of obstacles. This possibility gradually leads us towards the true mysteries of the Apocalypse, of the future of humanity. In this sense, the Apocalypse is also a manual for understanding, as we said in the introduction, what the mysteries are from today towards the future. Steiner, in this lecture, describes the continuity of the ancient mysteries in the act of consecration of man, and therefore in the new mysteries and their connection with the Apocalypse of John. To broaden the context in which this series of lectures was given, always bear in mind that when we speak of the act of consecration of man, if you want to see it in a broader sense, we can say the new mysteries. Among the new mysteries, there is also the act of consecration of man. So the new mysteries are not completely identified with the act of consecration of man. But since Steiner gave this series of lectures specifically to the Christian community, when he says act of consecration of man, he also implies the new mysteries. Sometimes he even says so, while at other times he specifies aspects that are contained in the act of consecration of man. So the Apocalypse of John can be seen as a bridge between the ancient mysteries and the later ones, between the mysteries in the past and what will be in the future. The Apocalypse and the new mysteries therefore belong to each other, and in the act of consecration of man, this belonging is established, it is founded on this belonging. There is a spiritual law that Rudolf Steiner tells us about, whereby the new mysteries are the way through which man opens itself to the divine through ritual and the sacrifice of the lower I. In this case, this takes place in the act of consecration of man, according to the path of Abel, while in Steiner's idea, Cain also does this, but through a different cult, a cult of a solar nature, while the Christian community is of a lunar nature that welcomes the solar element. For the new mysteries of Cain, this would in fact be the cult that was the foundation of the Anthroposophical Society in its origins, namely the so-called service of mystery. This cult, which had already been established in 1905 in the German section of the Theosophical Society, and which then in 1913 became the first foundation of the Anthroposophical Society, and then would have been established again in 1923-24 with the new Anthroposophical Society, would be the equivalent renewed cult of the new mysteries for the path of Cain. While when we speak of the active consecration of man and of the Christian community, we are talking of the new mysteries of Abel that welcome the impulse of Cain. On the other hand, the Apocalypse is the revelation of the divine, the spiritual knowledge that descends from the higher worlds, from the divine spiritual worlds. There is therefore an ascending path that goes from man to the gods and a descending path that goes from the gods to man. The renewal of the mysteries that man needs to bring about as a free, voluntary and conscious act is precisely the ascending path that goes from man to the gods. It is like a fire that rises. It is like the enthusiastic will of man that rises towards the gods. The other descending path is like a heavenly water that rains down from the heights of the divine spiritual worlds, and is given by the gods to man. In this rising of man's will, in the sacrifice of man's will, and on the other hand, in this descending of the heavenly water from the divinity, occurs the meeting of these two ascending and descending currents between these two paths. And at the center, the meeting point, are the new mysteries, the experience of the new mysteries. Only when the ascending path that goes from man to the gods and the descending path that goes from the gods to man meet, there arises the renewal of the mysteries and, in the sense of the Christian community, modern priesthood, which is a cosmic priesthood, inner and no longer dependent on an external authority. Now, what is the difference between the path of Abel and the path of Cain in this sense? Both can share in the renewal of the mysteries, the new mysteries, in the sense of the union of the ascending path with the descending path. What is the difference? It is that the souls who are still bound to the path of Abel, such as the Christian community, but in general all organized religions, need a mediator in their relationship with the spiritual world, just as Friedrich Rittelmeyer and the priests, his disciples, had Rudolf Steiner as a mediator of this experience with the spiritual world. The entire original founding group of the Christian community had Rudolf Steiner as their intermediary to the spiritual world. In the same way, the faithful in the church have an intermediary who is the priest. So there are the faithful, the priests in the spiritual world. The faithful turn to the priest mediates with the spiritual world reveals itself to the priest, and the priest reports this revelation to the faithful. This is the path of Abel. The renewed path of Abel also works in this way. The path of Cain, on the other hand, means that through a series of ascending degrees, each of those who set themselves on the path of Cain becomes a priest of themselves. This means that there are mediators. These mediators gradually allow each of those who form the group of the Cain's current to become mediators themselves. This is the difference. In the path of Abel, there are always faithful priests, the spiritual world. In the path of Cain's, there are ascending degrees through which the members gradually become, that is, those who are actually men of goodwill, men and women of goodwill, those who sacrifice their individual forces, become each their own priest. Everyone becomes capable of becoming a mediator of the spiritual world, and thus a group of mediators is created, a group of priests of themselves, who, by creating a community dynamic, become together mediators of the experience with the spiritual world. So, you understand that there is a great difference between the path of Cain and the path of Abel, and that the path of Abel will gradually give way completely to the path of Cain. Because the souls who will enter, for example, the Christian community, when they reincarnate in the sixth epoch of culture, will be prepared to join directly the path of Cain and thus become each a priest of themselves. Each one capable of establishing a direct relationship with the spiritual world. Obviously, the aim is not to establish this individually, but to form communities of spirit, communities of the brotherhood of spirit of the sixth cultural epoch or the Aquarian age. They are called in different ways: Christ communities, brotherhoods of spirit, and also Grail communities, as Rudolf Steiner calls them. So on the path of Cain, everyone becomes a priest, everyone becomes a mediator with the spiritual world, and several priests of the path of Cain together, of the solar path together, create a chalice, a grail, so that the spiritual world can reveal itself in imaginations, inspirations, and intuitions. This, we can say, apocalyptic priesthood is inner, cosmic, no longer dependent on an external authority, but while in the path of Abel it needs a mediator, in the way of Cain everyone gradually becomes a mediator. All that is the path of Abel will gradually give way to the path of Cain, incarnation after incarnation of the souls that belong to it. Therefore, the apocalypse is everything that was given as a occult truth by John the Evangelist to give humanity the right priestly impulse, renewed in the new mysteries. The apocalypse then is not just the book written by John, just as the Gospel of John is an initiatory manual. In the same way, the apocalypse is an initiatory revelation that brings to light in a new way the relationship between man and the divine, revealing a new way in which the divine can enter into relationship with man and how man can enter into relationship with the divine. The fact that man needs the sacrifice of its inner world in order to open doors and windows to the spiritual world. So much so to give you a reference image that the heavenly Jerusalem itself is conceived as a city with doors and windows where human beings who have become the pillars of this temple of the heavenly Jerusalem, this heavenly city, which is also a heavenly temple, have opened the doors, the windows to the spiritual world. For those who came with us on several occasions with Pleroma Viaggi, when we visited some churches, not least the Temple of Saint Michael in Perugia, but also, for example, in Mantua, in the so-called Rotonda di San Lorenzo, we saw various places that have this round shape. In that shape is the heavenly Jerusalem in nuce, with doors that open to the 4 cardinal points and the 12 windows that instead open towards the heights, to represent the relationship between 4, which is spatiality, sense physical space, and 12 as the archetype of space. The 12 points of view, or signs of the zodiac. This is to give you an image. When you see a round church, a round temple, you know that it has a relationship with the heavenly Jerusalem described in the Apocalypse, and it means, taking it as a metaphorical expression, opening doors and windows to the divine spiritual world. It is man who created a vehicle whose doors and windows are open to the spiritual world, and it's so from its free and conscious individuality as an act of will, as a willingness to sacrifice. The Apocalypse, therefore, is the mystery of metamorphosis, of how the divine reveals itself in time and how man learns to consecrate itself in this revelation. While in the ancient mysteries it was the divinity that revealed itself to man, now, given that the I must connect with the Christ, not I, but Christ in me, it is man who must connect with the divinity. In the ancient mysteries, the divinities appeared to man, revealed themselves to man. Now it is man who must reveal itself to the divinity. Obviously, only those who want it, called in the Gospels men of good will. Men understood in a general sense, so I will use this term because it is in the Gospels, but it means humanity of goodwill. There is no gender connection. All the more so, since, as Steiner describes in different cycles of lectures, sexuality as we know it will disappear, precisely because we are gradually abandoning the brotherhood of blood and moving towards the brotherhood of spirit. So in the ancient mysteries, what John brings us as images of the Apocalypse were transmitted by initiated priests in form suitable for the time. Today, however, it must arise as an inner experience of the consciousness soul, free and willing to sacrifice. This always means the sacrifice of the selfish aspect of man, of our inner world. The Apocalypse, which is composed mainly of images, of imaginations, spiritual images, but also spiritual words of inspirations, and derives from an encounter that John had with spiritual entities, thus from John's intuitions is a renewal of the image of the ancient mysteries. The priests of the ancient mysteries, the initiates of the ancient mysteries, were all on the path of Abel. After Christ, new initiates may appear, new priests renewed on the path of Cain. Who is the very first priest of the path of Cain? It is Lazarus, John the Evangelist. We saw Lazarus in the previous seminar on the Gospel of John and also in others. When Lazarus experiences this initiation that is failing, the so-called mystical death, spending 3.5 days in the sarcophagus in order to experience union with the spiritual worlds, this initiation is failing. Lazarus is in fact dying. Right then, the Christ arrives as new Hierophant of the mysteries. He raises Lazarus, elevates him, and at the moment the solar Kenite path of initiation is born. Why? First of all, because it is Christ who performs this initiation of Lazarus, who becomes John the Evangelist, and therefore the foundation of John's church is in fact a Kenite church. Let us think of the Templars. Let us think of the Rosicrucians. Let us think of Christian esotericism. And also because Lazarus himself, John the Evangelist, is Cain. He is the reincarnation of Cain. And his sister Mary Magdalene is the reincarnation of Abel. And so, beneath the cross, are Abel and Cain united in the sacrifice of Christ. Abel, that is Mary Magdalene, brings devotion, which will then evolve into what we know as the imaginative path, which in Egypt is called the Book of Thoth, and later becomes known as the Tarot, or Tarot cards, as we commonly call them. The whole path that uses devotion, the imaginative capacity to relate to the spiritual world. Whereas Joan's path is the path of knowledge, of a thinking that is pure and free from the senses, which leads to the Gospel of Joan and the Apocalypse. I will also tell you briefly, to give you reference to the fact that there is a consonance between the path of Magdalene and that of Joan the Evangelist, or if you like, of Abel and Cain with respect to the sacrifice of Christ at the mystery of Golgotha, that it is possible to discern a one-to-one descriptive correspondence of the 22 major arcana of the Tarot and the chapters of the Apocalypse. This is because there is a complete mirroring between a devotional path of Mary Magdalene and the path of knowledge of Joan the Evangelist. Joan the Evangelist will then reincarnate as Christian Rosenkreuz. It is the same individuality that reincarnates, and therefore, as I was saying, the Church of Joan also becomes the Rosicrucian path. It is its evolution. And what will be described by the Rosicrucians? The book T, which is none other than the book of Tarot, of the Tarot cards of the path of Magdalene. So, you see that in the Rosicrucians, this effort gradually brings together devotion and knowledge. This is to give you references that we have brought up in other seminars. But if we leave them out, it becomes difficult to understand what has been described. So I give them to you as references, but I won't expand on them any further here. Steiner describes 4 stages of metamorphosis of the mysteries. He calls them ancient mysteries, semi-ancient mysteries, semi-new mysteries, and new mysteries. Steiner states that we are at the turning point between the semi-new mysteries and the new mysteries. So many of the mysteries and mystery forms practiced today are still strongly linked to the semi-new ones. And there are also some that are linked in a certain way to the semi-ancient ones, and others that are still linked to the ancient mysteries. But the majority are semi-new. As Steiner says, we are observing, and we need to grasp this impulse, to bring the semi-new mysteries to be completely renewed into new mysteries. Here I'll give you a brief reference to the description that Steiner makes. The ancient mysteries were primordial mysteries which originated with the expulsion from the earthly paradise. So there are Lemurian mysteries of Lemuria and Atlantean mysteries of Atlantis, as well as post-Atlantean archaic mysteries, that is, right after the flood. The Paleo-Indian ones, in particular, from the Paleo-Indian epoch, and others from an early Paleo-Persian epoch. In these ancient mysteries that have to do with primordial times, the gods, and in general the divine spiritual world, all the supersensible beings, so we are also talking about those below the angels, for example, the elementary beings, the devas, descend and reveal themselves to human beings. The sacred language of these mysteries is a cosmic language that expresses itself in sound and rhythm. So we have to imagine that originally, from Lemuria, sound and rhythm prevailed, and then later, during the whole Atlantean epoch and the early post-Atlantean, Paleo-Indian and Paleo-Persian epochs, gradually words also appear. Language, as we know it, evolves, in fact. With the semi-ancient mysteries, we arrive at the third epoch of culture. These are the Egypto-Chaldean mysteries that we find in Egypt, Chaldea, and Babylon, and among those who are the earliest Hebrew people. What happens? The relationship between man and the divine is such that humans still receive the gods who reveal themselves to human beings, but in an attenuated form. They begin to retreat, to distance themselves, and therefore man no longer has a direct encounter with the gods, with the supersensible beings. And the sacred language is the sacred word mediated by the symbol. So from sound and rhythm, we move on to the sacred word mediated by the symbol. Then, between the third and fourth cultural epochs, we move to the semi-new mysteries. These are the Greco-Christian mysteries, such as the mysteries of Eleusis and those of the early Christian centuries, where the relationship between man and the divine is such that human beings begin to seek the divine within themselves, in their inner being. Why? Because the I has entered completely into the physical body of man. The mystery of Golgotha has taken place. For the Greeks, the mystery of Golgotha is happening. After them, it has happened, and as a result, man begins to seek the divine within itself. The sacred language is the inspired human language. Inspired by this relationship with the divine, we find this, for example, in the saints of the early centuries. Until the 13th century AD, this is the prevailing path. Then from 1413 onwards, the beginning of the epoch of the consciousness soul, the possibility of founding new mysteries begins to become increasingly apparent. Mysteries of which the Rosicrucians will already be a part. In fact, anthroposophical spiritual science, which is part of the new mysteries, is based on the Rosicrucians. In those, the relationship between man and the divine is such that the divine is resurrected within man itself. The sacred language, a spiritual language of the heart, is the thinking of the heart that is translated into words, and all ancient methods can be renewed. Precisely because the divine has risen within man himself in the consciousness soul. What does consciousness soul mean in this sense? It means that the I of man grasps itself in full consciousness in the relationship with matter, with incarnation in matter. In this grasping, it becomes self-conscious. More and more conscious of itself. Consequently, when the I becomes fully self-conscious within the human being, that is, I recognize myself as an incarnated I, the divine rises again within man. We can say that I as an individual, the consciousness soul is an individual evolution, and this is fundamental in order to then reach the evolution of the spiritual self of the sixth cultural epoch. I begin to realize that the Christ lives in me. When Paul says, not I, he means not my lower I, but Christ, my higher I, within me. So the spiritual language of the heart is the language of the higher I, because the higher I dwells in the heart, while the incarnated I dwells at the root of the nose, between the eyes. This, to give you another reference, is called the mystery of Golgotha, which means the mystery of the skull, because the eye is completely incarnated in the skull at the root of the nose between the eyes. From that moment, at the mystery of Golgotha, the Christ descends for 3.5 days into the bowels of the earth and reaches the heart of the earth, the center of the earth. And so our evolutionary passage is to move from an eye perceived as incarnated at the root of the nose between the eyes to the eye that dwells in the heart. Just as Christ accomplished the mystery of the skull and then descended to the heart of the earth, so man perceives itself in its skull, in its head, and then it will perceive itself as a higher I in the heart. This is the movement we are making from the consciousness soul towards the spiritual self, from our fifth epoch towards the sixth, from Pisces to Aquarius. Today, we are in the process of initiating to take the step between what remains of the semi-new mysteries and the new mysteries. The new mysteries of Christ, the fourth stage of metamorphosis of the mysteries. In this fourth stage, the sacrifice is internal and the revelation is apocalyptic, that is, both internal and cosmic, microcosmic and macrocosmic at the same time. So the images of the apocalypse speak simultaneously of the microcosm and the macrocosm, as well as of the past and the future. We can understand this also in another way. We live in space-time, we are incarnated in space-time, so we, our I, is incarnated in a sense-physical body and experiences space-time. But when we are resurrected in this sacrifice to the divine spiritual world, degree by degree, what happens is that the first dimensions we lose are space and time. John the Evangelist, who speaks to us of imaginations, inspirations, and intuitions, which are the apocalypse, does so from outside space-time. Thus, the apocalypse speaks simultaneously of the past, the present, and the future, as well as of the microcosm, the interiority of man, and the macrocosm, the world outside of man. In the ancient mysteries, to characterize better and better, we had the descent of the gods. The gods descended and revealed themselves to man in the seats of the mysteries, and man, the initiated priests, frequented the gods as being to being, we could say. That is, they frequented them as beings that they actually encountered, they met. So man encountered the gods directly. This is because the veil between the supersensible worlds and the physical world was not so thick. The human being had not yet sunk so deeply into matter. In particular, in the primordial times of Lemuria and Atlantis, in the mystery temples of Lemuria and Atlantis, communion with the gods was objective. In the cults of Lemuria and Atlantis, the gods presented themselves before man. In fact, Steiner says, and we have seen this in Myths and Mysteries of ancient Egypt, all ancient religions are a memory of this encounter with the gods. Thus, what we call the act of consecration of man, the new mysteries today, which today are fully conscious, was then a thoroughly cosmic event because the gods revealed themselves objectively and the divine was present in the substance of worship, of rituality. There was then an original transubstantiation, not a symbolic transformation of bread and wine, but an actual infusion of the divine into cosmic substances. The divine descended into substance, into matter, and in this revealing of itself, it caused matter to be transmuted. Now you can no longer see the image because for some reason I can no longer share in it. I will try to describe it. Steiner continues saying, there was always a small surplus remainder. The priests of the ancient mysteries paid particular attention to this small remainder, to what remained by difference. This was a certain substance, a substance that remained from the sacrifices that were made to the divinity, and at the same time it was the known coincidence between what was the human experience on earth and the cosmic experience of the gods. This small remainder was the original disharmony, the original incomplete identification between the perfect cosmic rhythm and human earthly time. In other words, there was both a remainder of the sacrifices that were performed in the ancient mysteries and a temporal discrepancy between the human calendar and cosmic time in its becoming. An example of such discrepancy are the holy nights. The holy nights are the small discrepancy remainder between the lunar year and the solar year, between the cosmic year according to the moon and the cosmic year according to the sun, according to their cosmic rhythms. They are a special time because we know that we can receive, for example, prophetic images of the coming year in dreams. And it is the time of the year when we can enter into a more intense relationship with the Christ within earth. Man, unable to measure perfectly the cosmic cycles of divine nature, for example, lunar and solar, always came up with a difference, a small remainder, a discrepancy. And we can call this difference a sacred gap through which the gods could enter in a more powerful, more intense way into the world, just as during the holy nights. In the ancient mysteries, the priests watched over these temporal thresholds. We can also call them that, over these sacred gaps in the discrepancy between cosmic time and human time. On those days, the veil between the spiritual world and the earthly world became thinner. We can say that these were the moments when the cosmos stood still and the gods could communicate more directly with humans. This also happens within the seasons. One of these remainders, for example, is called All Saints' Day Eve, All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day. And the polar opposite to this is Walpurgis Night with May Day, i.e. 30th April and the first week of May. Similarly, in winter we have the Holy Nights from 24th December to 6th January, and the Midsummer Dream Nights in June around Saint John the Baptist, from the 21st to the 28th. In these temporal thresholds, which also correspond, as you understand, to the days around the solstice and the days around the equinoxes, it was possible to access the relationship, a privileged relationship with the deities. Today, we experience this process unconsciously because we are not aware of it. When we internalize this process of difference between divine cosmic time and human earthly time, we do this by awakening to our inner nature, awakening to the fact that we are incarnated selves. And then at that moment, even today, we can return more powerfully to the relationship with the divine spiritual world. Therefore, in anthroposophical practices, from the point of view of the cycle of the year as a meditative practice, which is also called the path of initiation of Michael, these threshold moments are highlighted. They are the cycle of the 4 festivals during the year: Christmas, Easter, St. John's Day, and St. Michael's Day. These passages, these temporal thresholds, are the discrepancies between different rhythms. We have All Saints' Eve, All Souls' Day, then we have the Holy Nights, then we have Walpurgis Night and May Day, and then we have the Midsummer Dream Nights. On these temporal thresholds, just as the ancient initiates were the guardians of these thresholds, allowing the souls to enter into a more powerful relationship with the divine, today we can grasp this rhythm of the ear in order to enter into a conscious relationship more powerfully with the divine spiritual world. Precisely as I was saying before, to make ourselves initiated priests in the renewal of the mysteries. Now, in the ancient mysteries, as I was saying, there was also waste substance. There was a part that was sacrificed and accepted as a sacrifice. Imagine, for example, a substance being burned in a Holocaust. Imagine Cain and Abel. Abel, who was a herdsman, offered the sacrifice of the head of cattle. Cain, on the other hand, offered the fruit of the harvest as a sacrifice because he was a farmer. These sacrifices were burned, and a part remained as a remnant. This remnant was particularly important because it was the substance that could be further transformed. This transformation in the ancient mysteries was exactly what we might call an alchemical transformation. So, what happened? Within the ancient mysteries, these substances that remained from the sacrifice were diluted in a liquid substance that we alchemically call the mercurial element, mercury, which you should not imagine as the metal mercury, but as a medium, a liquid medium, a solution in a chemical sense. Thus, a living fluid substance was generated that allowed mediation between spirit and matter. In alchemical and hermetic texts, it is called philosophical mercury. With this mercurial element, with this philosophical mercury, the priests sought to prolong the time between two temporal thresholds. For example, between St. Michael's Day and Christmas, or between Christmas and Easter, or between Easter and St. John's Day, or between St. John's Day and St. Michael's Day, with their relative temporal thresholds. They sought to prolong in profane time to divine action that had taken place on the sacred days. This mercurial element allowed them to maintain a living memory of contact with the divine, with the gods. The mercurial water, this philosophical mercury, was preserved, and Steiner says that this act in the ancient mysteries corresponds today in the new mysteries to remembering Christ in the heart. Which means that between two of these four main festivals, one preserves inwardly that living force of contact with the divine that transforms the soul of man even in periods of time when the world appears profane. Furthermore, as I was saying, in the ancient mysteries, a cosmic language was spoken. The sacred language was a language of sound and rhythm. The language of the mysteries was not a human language, but a language of the gods, a cosmic language. It was the language of rhythms, of archetypal sounds that acted directly on etheric and astral forces. The initiated priests were the medium for this, and they spoke this cosmic language that came to them from the gods. And so every word was a magical and sacramental act, because it had a direct effect on the etheric astral. So, in the new mysteries, this cosmic language rises again, as I mentioned before, from the human heart, and it is an inner word that is transmuted in full consciousness. Steiner says, the act of consecration of man is the new cosmic language of the Christified I. And we could say, in a broader sense for the new mysteries, which also include those of Cain, as I was mentioning, the act of consecration of the man of the Christian community belongs to the path of Abel. In the path of Cain, in the same way, this cosmic language is the one that arises when the I, which grasps itself in a fully self-conscious way, turns to the spiritual world, to come into contact and become a collaborator of the spiritual world. Steiner therefore says that the new mysteries are the path of sacred knowledge, and the apocalypse is the object of sacred knowledge. So the new mysteries are the initiatory path that leads to contact with the new, renewed divine. And the apocalypse is the cosmic truth that is revealed to those who walk this path. Whoever consciously celebrates or participates in the new mysteries enters into the apocalyptic process, becomes witness of the Christ I, who does not manifest himself outwardly, as in the fourth cultural epoch in a physical body, but in the heart of man, in the contact with the higher I, which thus opens the way to the perception of the supersensible worlds. Rudolf Steiner reveals to us this evolution of the relationship between man and the divine through the cult. We have seen the ancient, semi-ancient, semi-new and new mysteries. The apocalypse and the new mysteries, including the act of consecration of man, are the final metamorphosis of this evolution of the mysteries in stages. We have briefly seen the divine directly revealing itself objectively to man in the ancient mysteries. Then we have seen the semi-ancient mysteries in which already the gods held back a little. Then we saw the semi-new mysteries where man seeks the divine within itself, and the new mysteries where man experiences the divine resurrecting within man itself. They are a foreshadowing of the new mysteries of Christ. Indeed, in the new mysteries of Christ, everything contained in the previous mysteries is brought to synthesis and renewal, as I mentioned. That is, everything is in the new mysteries, but in a new form. For this reason, the Christ will say, I make all things new. In the semi-ancient mysteries, the gods, we said, withdrew from men. I have now spoken of the ancient mysteries. Now, let us speak of the semi-ancient mysteries. So, in the semi-ancient mysteries, the gods no longer descended powerfully with their whole being into the mysteries, into the temples of the mysteries, but they still sent forth their forces. So it was not so much they themselves who revealed themselves, but the forces they sent. And it is a time of transition from the point of view of the relationship with the divine. After the era of the ancient mysteries, when the gods were still present in person, in the Lemurian era, the Atlantean era, and in the first two post-Atlantean epochs, Paleo-Indian and Paleo-Persian, we have the gods radiating their spiritual forces in the temples. Man no longer lives with the direct vision of the divine, but must learn to grasp the forces of the divine being in the sense-physical world. Thus, what we call alchemy came into being. There was, so to speak, the alchemy of the ancient mysteries, which was performed by the gods. That is, the gods revealed themselves in a substance, transubstantiated it, and as a result, this substance continued to act because the gods had acted in it. Now, instead, a new alchemy was emerging, performed by man. Here Steiner refers to the fact that in the alchemy of the semi-ancient mysteries, substances called ferments are developed. A ferment is a living substance that retains its power through various transformations. It is a germ, we might say, immutable, that transmutes without ever getting lost. In chemistry, it is called a catalyst. A catalyst is a substance that remains the same from the beginning to the end of an alchemical transmutation, or if you like, a chemical reaction without degrading. It participates in the reaction, but at the beginning, during, and at the end, it remains the same. In alchemy, ferments, these catalysts, are the principle of the continuity of spirit in matter, the divine spark of spirit that remains in the cycles of generation and corruption of the substance of matter. In the semi-ancient mysteries, and he gives the example of Egypt, of Chaldea, but also of late Persia, we also mentioned Babylon, priests preserved sacred substances, these ferments, which had received the imprint of ancient divine transubstantiations. In them was the echo of divine forces. In particular, these were preserved within crystal containers in which the spirit of the sun, this in the solar mysteries, but it also applies to other planetary mysteries, could still manifest itself in a visible way as brightness and splendor. So imagine that they preserved these crystals inside which there were ferments, these catalysts, which shone like a small sun. Steiner says that this is the primordial form of the Blessed Sacrament that is also found in the Church, for example. Indeed, he says that these containers were like small suns, equivalent to what is the monstrance of the Blessed Sacrament today, which, however, today, compared to that time, is only a sort of memory, if not an imitation. The Blessed Sacrament, for those who may not be familiar with this terminology, is a host consecrated in the Eucharist, displayed in what is called a monstrance, which is an object, a pedestal, that can show through glass this substance transubstantiated in the Eucharist. What happens is that it is usually decorated to look like a sun. So, Steiner says that this is actually a reminder of what in the semi-ancient mysteries were these crystals that contained these ferments, that is, a spiritual activity within matter. What we see today in church, the Blessed Sacrament, is only a reminder of that. In ancient times, the priest, who was an initiate of the path of Abel, saw sunlight emanating from the consecrated substance. This was, therefore, not a symbol, as it is today, but a real spiritual phenomenon. It was the fire of the spiritual sun breaking through matter, and therefore, in fact, the forces of Christ before incarnation, because Christ is the spirit of the sun. In the semi-ancient mysteries, to be able to see this little sun, this fire of the spiritual sun breaking through matter, meant becoming a priest inwardly. It was the final step to becoming a priest. We are talking about Egypt, Chaldea, late Persia, Babylon, and so on. So the vision of this little sun was an initiatory experience. The inner transformation of the celebrant, of the priest, was contemporary with the transmutation of substance. It was a true communion between microcosm and macrocosm. Today, when you enter a church and look at the Blessed Sacrament, it is only a symbol, a reminder of what could be deeply experienced in the semi-ancient mysteries of the third cultural epoch. Steiner, to further clarify, points out that what we consider to be the true image of the Eucharist in Catholicism is in truth the decayed image of that reality of the semi-ancient mysteries of the third cultural epoch, in which the divine was directly visible in the ferments of light, in these crystals that contained the substances that had been permeated by divine forces. And here Steiner will say, as we have already said on several occasions, that the Catholic liturgy, and by extension that of the Christian churches in general, preserves ancient forms. In particular, the Catholic one is the one that preserves them the most, but has lost the living force that once animated it and is therefore an extinct memory of the mysteries. It is a mere form, however much it may be a form very close to that of the ancient mysteries. We come now to the semi-new mysteries. In the semi-new mysteries, we said one sought a relationship with the divine within oneself. Here arises the Mass of more modern times, in particular the Mass in its ancient form, which underwent a further transformation. For example, to mention just one element, there was a shift from Latin to the language of the nation, or the fact that initially the celebrant turned his back on the faithful, whereas today he faces them. This evolutionary phase of the semi-new mysteries that we find in the Mass, especially in its oldest form, is the third evolutionary phase of the mysteries, the third stage of metamorphosis. The divinity no longer radiates direct forces, but it is man who begins to ascend towards the spiritual world from within. This already happens shortly before the mystery of Golgotha, and then will happen in the first 13 centuries after the mystery of Golgotha. At the beginning of the Greco-Roman epoch, in the mysteries of Eleusis, in the mysteries of Samothrace, and in primitive Christian forms, as well as in esoteric Christianity. What happens is that language is perceived inwardly. Knowledge of the inner being of sound arises, and the word acquires its own power. An inspired human language. A language, we might say, that becomes the new organ of worship, the Christ, the Word, the Logos, incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth, thus giving man the ability to utter a word that gradually becomes conscious of itself. At the same time, however, the gods no longer speak in the world. It is the voice of humanity that can awaken divine forces through a renewal of rhythm, sound, intonation, and inner intensity. So this inspired word, this magical word, is the language of the Logos that is rekindled in the soul. In fact, it is an echo of the word of Christ, so much so that even gospel means a story, a piece of news, something that is transmitted through the word. I communicate the gospel through the word. I bring you the word of Christ. In the Egyptian and Greek traditions, this magical word, this language of the Logos, is linked to the power of the creative word, the creative Logos, that is, to the vibration that formed and shaped the substance of the world. We find this in John. In the beginning was the Logos. We also saw this in the last seminar. So even before the mystery of Golgotha, the mystery of the Logos made flesh, of the Word made flesh, was being prepared, which John then places at the beginning of the prologue to his Gospel. It is directly linked to those spiritual currents that existed before the mystery of Golgotha, and which use the word Logos to indicate the divine word that shapes the world. Finally, it was incarnated with the mystery of Golgotha, and thus human beings could awaken it. In the Gospels, this happens at Pentecost, when receiving the Holy Spirit, or the I Am, the disciples become apostles and can speak all the languages of the world, bringing the Gospel, transmitting it to others through the Word. The most ancient liturgies were based on rhythm, sound, and inner resonance, so that the language of worship could open hearts. And when the priest pronounces the sacred word, his voice becomes a vehicle for the divine breath, and the hearts of men are touched by the cosmic vibrations of the word. Steiner also calls it the magic of sound. The word becomes magical. This will culminate in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Logos. In the beginning was the Word. Here you can see a sketch made by Rudolf Steiner of the Kabairai of Samothrace, of the mysteries of Samothrace. So again, in these semi-new mysteries, Steiner says that there lived this element of the Kabairai, of the three Kabairai, as a cult that has brought forces into humanity at the stage. The Kabairai are deities of the mysteries of Samothrace. Here Steiner represents them as three vessels, which were, we might say, the symbolic forms of these three Kabairai of the mysteries of Samothrace. And they are underground creative forces. They are spirits of fire who from the interior of the earth, and therefore of the human being, forge destiny and matter. They were guardians of the triple fire, of the three forms of fire, of that fire that prepares the birth of the I. We have said that the I is the inner fire that transforms everything. Just as Christ says, I make all things new, the I makes all things new. The Christ I makes all things new, we could say. So the mystery cult of the Kabairai is in fact a precursor of the impulse of Christ, of what Christ would bring as the I, as the inner fire that burns within the human being. As to Moses, it had appeared as the burning bush. I am the I am. So the I am becomes an inner fire in the human being. The Christ I in man. So these three Kabairai, these three spirits in the mysteries of Greece, are precursors of Christ's action, guardians of the inner flames of fire. They prepare for the birth of the I. These three Kabairai, which Steiner brings in the image of these three vases, had names. They were called Axeres, Axiokerses, and Axiokersa. To these a fourth was added, whom we must imagine as the observer of the three vessels of the Kabairai, called Kasmios or Kadmilos. So Kasmilos or Kadmilos is what we call the candidate of the mysteries and mediated by the Hierophant of the mysteries of Samothrace, stood before these three spirits, Axeres, Axiokerses, and Axiokersa. In these three spirits, man was able to understand that within him would be born three fires, three activities, we might call them. The activity of conscious thinking, of conscious willing, of conscious feeling, meaning permeated by the fire of the I. Whereas before, human beings perceived thoughts, feelings, and volitional impulses as something external to themselves, deriving from the gods and presenting themselves objectively in the mysteries or with their forces, but always from outside the inner being of man. Now, shortly before the mystery of Golgotha, they have a prophetic image of how thinking, feeling, and willing are being trained in the human soul. We also know these three spirits by other names. They are Michael, Samael, and Anael. The archangel of the sun, the archangel of Mars, and the archangel of Venus. Their titles, so to speak, are in fact Michael, archangel of the sun, flaming prince of solar thinking. Samael, powerful prince of volcanic fire. And Anael, shining prince of astral light. So, archangel of the sun, of Mars, of Venus, Axeres, Axiochursus, Axiochursa, thinking, willing, and feeling. They were encountered in an underground cavity in the depth of the earth. Why? Because earth was experienced as a living being that had its own interiority. So descending into the depth of the earth, into the candidate, into the cosmos of the mysteries of Samothrace, was to become conscious of one's own interiority. The cave in the depth of the earth, where one met these three Kabirae, was equivalent to becoming aware that this tribe of fire would be revealed in one's own inner self. This tribe of fire is the same that in the Hebrew mysteries, those of Moses, is called Shin, the Hebrew letter of fire, which in fact consists of three, we might say, extensions that join three flames, which are the Yod, three Yod joined by a trident. Thus, we have the mysteries of Samothrace and the Hebrew mysteries that prophetically prelude what the Christ will bring as inner fire in thinking, feeling, and willing. And I was telling you, in fact, also the Shin in the Hebrew mysteries has the same meaning as the Kabirae. The mysteries of Samothrace, of the Kabirae, were rites of transmutation where man learned through sound and gesture to cooperate with those spiritual forces that transmuted matter into light. Forces that were soon to operate within man, but not yet. The Christ was still to come. It would happen soon. You may be surprised to have learned that they were precisely these three archangels, Michael, Samael, and Anael, but you must bear in mind that there is a connection. The island of Samothrace was reached by sailors, and it was sailors in particular who became candidates for the mysteries of Samothrace of the Kabirae. Where do we find a connection? We find a connection in the usual attributions, for example, of the Archangel Michael, in the fact that Michael is the protector of ships in storms. The sailors at the time of the mysteries of Samothrace practiced the cult of the Kabbalah in order to be protected during navigation in storms, just as Michael protects from this. Those who came with us to Mont Saint-Michel will remember that Michael is presented as the guardian of ships in storms. There are also ships in the cathedral to represent this, the ex votos, let's say, of the protection given by Michael. The same was true in the mysteries of Samothrace. If you want to have a further image, just as the cave where the Kabbalah met was the interiority of the soul that was still in the unconscious and therefore thinking, feeling and willing, could only be foreseen as agents of man's interiority towards the world. In the same way, the sea is the whole world of emotions. The Kabbalah granted protection from those emotions over which man could not yet have complete control in the I. Steiner says that this cult of the Kabbalah also marks the transition from the material ferments we talked about earlier, the mercurial element in which the deity had acted directly, to a sound ferment that is from the spirit acting in matter to the spirit acting in sounds. And this foreshadows the activity of the Christ who performs miracles through the word. For example, rise up, Lazarus, rise up and walk. To recap briefly, in the primordial mysteries, in the ancient mysteries of Lemuria and Atlantis, and at the beginning of the Paleo-Indian, Paleo-Persian epochs, there was the direct vision of the deities, direct encounter with the deity. The sacred instrument were the cosmic substances where the deity had manifested itself, preserved in the mercurial element, and the gods had descended directly into the substance. Then we have the semi-ancient mysteries, those of Egypt, Chaldea, Babylon, but also the primordial archaic Hebrew ones, where the key to knowledge is contact with the spirit of the sun that one had through the ferments preserved in these light-emitting crystals, where the gods no longer descended directly but emanated their forces, the semi-ancient mysteries. And then the semi-new mysteries, those of Greece, Samothrace, but also those immediately after the impulse of Christ, where the key to knowledge is the creative word. The sacred instruments are sound, rhythm, and liturgy. And man conquers this inspired word, this magic word. The Christ brings the fourth metamorphosis of the mysteries, uniting all the previous paths into a single path. We can call it mysteries of the heart or mysteries of love, if you will. The ferment metamorphoses into the yeast of the spirit, life that transforms the eye. The solar light becomes the light of the risen Christ, and the magic word or inspired word becomes the incarnate Logos, the word that gives itself to man. These three metamorphoses are all present in the new mysteries. In the new mysteries, initiation can be given through biography, life events, life that initiates man into the mysteries of the I. The spiritual light that allows one to know the spiritual worlds is that of the risen Christ, or if you want to say it another way, the etheric Christ. The word is awakened from within man and returns this time to receive its strength from the resurrection of Christ. Thus, the new mysteries are the evolutionary synthesis of all previous mysteries. Each phase has internalized a step in the descent and ascent between man and God. Steiner says the substance of the ancient mysteries, the luminous force of the semi-ancient mysteries, and the creative word of the semi-new mysteries, these three, the substance of ancient mysteries, the luminous force of the semi-ancient mysteries, and the creative word of the semi-new mysteries, we can also call them the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So the substance corresponds to the Father, the solar light, the luminous force to the Son, and this creative word found anew to the Holy Spirit. All these correspond then to ancient mysteries, semi-ancient mysteries, semi-new mysteries. In the new mystery of Christ, in the new mysteries, if we want to say more generally, which is also what the Christian community celebrates with the act of consecration of man, all these three powers unite in the human I that offers itself as a living monstrance, because that is where the sacrificial act takes place. The new Eucharist is supersensible and takes place with the participation of the I in Christ's sacrifice. Steiner connects the transition from the semi-new mysteries to the new mysteries, and in particular from the ancient path of the Kabbalah to the new path of the Christ, to the foundation of the Christian community with this new priesthood at the Goetheanum. Because we have said, let us remember, that the mysteries of the Kabbalah are the mysteries of fire, of the tribe of fire, to which is then added the fourth fire, which is the self-conscious I. We have said that there are actually four Kabbalah, but one of them is the observer. Of the Kabbalah, we have said that there is Michael, Samael, Anael, but there is also the candidate, who is ignited by this fire. So they are thinking, willing, feeling, and the I. Four fires, also called in esoteric lessons fourfold philosophical fire, referring to their chemical tradition. There is a meditation on the fourfold philosophical fire. It refers precisely to this, to the Kabbalah, and to the candidate for initiation into the Kabbalah. This time it is reversed. Before it was thinking, feeling, and willing that were approaching the I. Now, after the Christ, it is the I that radiates thinking, feeling, and willing. Steiner says that the transition between the third and fourth stages of the mysteries, particularly between the Kabbalah and Christ, is the moment when humanity's mysterious past, which lived in ferments, light and sound, is gathered into a new spiritual fire destined to be rekindled in the human heart as a living altar, in the eye, in the higher eye that dwells in the heart of man, the solar eye. Steiner now speaks again of the mystery of the Kabbalah. He says that the altar of the Kabbalah is the altar where the mystery of the speaking smoke took place. He continues, "Let us place before our soul the altar of the Kabbalah of Samothrace. This altar is not a simple object, it is the image of the human soul itself, which is still enveloped in the darkness of the cave, in the bowels of the earth." These sacrificial jugs that you see here, in the shape of the three Kabbalah, thinking, feeling, and willing, represented the vessels of transformation. They are vessels, that is, the place where the substance, the heat, the word, came together. In man, these jugs, these vessels, correspond to the inner centers of the soul, to the vessels in which thinking, feeling, and willing are transmuted by the spirit, that is, by the fire of the eye. The Hebrew, shin. Obviously, this is also a future image of the threefold spirit: spiritual self, life spirit, spirit man, in a higher arc of development. So, we move from the substances of the ferments to spiritual substances, substances available to human knowledge when it was able to penetrate the spiritual core of the substance itself. It was no longer a substance that had been permeated by the divine, but now it was man who, with the rudiment of the divine, entered into the substance. What would then become the eye that transmutes the substance? From the original cosmic alchemy practiced by the gods to a human alchemy that transmuted matter through the eye. In this third stage of the semi-new mysteries, such as those of the Kabbalah, the connection with the divine is no longer in matter fermented by the divine, but in the intelligence that progressively spiritualizes itself, entering into substance. Therefore, the priest no longer acts through cosmic relics or substances prepared by the gods, but through a knowledge that becomes progressively spiritualized and thus penetrates matter, tracing and experiencing its spiritual origin. This was called, in the third cultural epoch, gnosis, spiritual knowledge. The spirit that is read in matter. Thus, there is a transition from a magic that used substances that had been transmuted by the divine to a magic in which the substance begins to be transmuted by spiritual knowledge, by gnosis. Man itself thanks to the word and consciousness, becomes the mediator of this transmutation. So he says, imagine this, these substances were burned in a holocaust. The smoke rose upwards in curls, and the magical language acted so that in the sacrificial smoke, rising in curls, the imagination of what was in tune with the word appeared. A word was pronounced in the smoke by the hierophant of the mystery of the Kabbalah of Samothrace, and in the smoke appeared the imagination corresponding to the word. From this, for example, also derives the widespread use of smoke in the theatre, which in turn derives from the mysteries, as well as in early cinema, which is itself a derivation of theatre. So, in a sense, there is a derivation between what was enacted in the mysteries, the mystery rites, and the theatre, tragedy in particular, and from this the beginning of cinema. If you look at the early films, for example, of the German tradition, in the early 20th century, you see extensive use of smoke. It derives as recollection of the use of smoke in the mysteries. In the sacrificial rites of the Kabbalah, the physical substance, through heat in particular, becomes spiritualized, becomes sacrificial smoke in this combustion, and the sacrificial smoke becomes a vehicle of the imagination. The priest's inspired magical language, combined with heat and scent, and also the use of essential oils and incenses, awakens the visible form of sound. Therefore, the smoke that is shaped by the word becomes a mirror of the word. Sound becomes image. Image shines as a message from the divine. So, Steiner says that this is the degree of the imaginative word. In the ancient mysteries, man received divine forces directly as a vision. In the semi-ancient mysteries, he perceived divine light in substances, illumination. In the semi-new mysteries, he projects the spiritual image into the world through the word in sacrificial smoke. So, vision of substance in the ancient mysteries, light divine in substances, illumination in semi-ancient mysteries, imaginative word in semi-new mysteries. We have already called them substance, light, word, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. As I mentioned before, Steiner says that this is the prelude to artistic creation of poetry, of Orphic chant, and of the gospel itself. In the sacrificial smoke, the priests recognized the imaginations, and here transubstantiation took place. Indeed, says Steiner, it was a true spiritual experience. The priest finally entered the sacrificial smoke as if it were his own element where he could move. The ether of imagination. The priest, the hierophant, became the smoke itself, becoming part of the element of transmutation. The sacrificial smoke is the intermediate substance between matter and light, like the soul between the body and the spirit. Therefore, the becoming of the human soul was perceived in the smoke. Steiner says that when the priest himself becomes smoke, he knows himself in the smoke, because it is his externalized soul. In so doing, he experiences the identity of the soul with the atmosphere of transmutation, or, if you like, the identity of the human soul with that smoke that is transmuted. The moment when word, heat, and sacrifice, the sacrificed substance, are united. It is the third stage of development of the mysteries that leads to the fourth. It is the transition between the third and fourth. It is the beginning of the new mysteries, and it is also contained in the act of consecration of man for the path of Abel, as it is in Mizraim for the path of Cain. Steiner says that these early stages gradually fell into decline, but even today something of them has been preserved, precisely because they are the beginning of the new stage of mysteries, of the new mysteries themselves. And so Steiner says, where did we find this fire that generated sacrificial smoke, in which the word was spoken, that led to the foundation of the new mysteries, including the Christian community? In the Holocaust of the first Goetheanum. The burning of the first Goetheanum with these enormous curls of smoke is the becoming, in an external event, as if on a large sacrificial altar, of the transition between the mysteries of the third stage and those of the fourth stage, between the semi-new and the new mysteries. So much so that the name of the Goetheanum, before being Goethe's building, where the Goethean view of the world, i.e. phenomenological, is cultivated, was Johannesbau, John's building, where the word is spoken, where the Logos is spoken. In the beginning was the Logos. Thus, the progressive decline of the first three stages of the mysteries, ancient, semi-ancient, and semi-new, substance, light, and word, is also simultaneously the beginning of the fourth stage that encompasses them all, synthesizes them, and completely renews them. This fourth stage of the new mysteries is no longer based on the direct descent of the gods, as in the ancient mysteries, because it would be a return to mediumship. It is in mediumship that the divine spiritual world reveals itself directly and overwhelms the eye. In the ancient mysteries, the eye was not yet within the human being, so this could be done. Indeed, the gods were preparing for the arrival of the eye in man. It is no longer based on the forces sent by the gods of the semi-ancient mysteries, because these forces now emanate from the eye, from the interiority of the human being, from the God in man, the Christ eye. Nor is it based on the magic word of sacrifice in the semi-new mysteries, because it is a word that participates in the forces of Christ's resurrection. So the new mysteries certainly use the word, the light, the life forces and also substance, but everything is based on the human I awakened by Christ. Without this awakening, there are no new mysteries. We can talk about them, but they cannot actually be practiced. Therefore, the priest of the new mysteries no longer works with external ferments of fumes, but with his own heart as an altar, and with his own word consecrated by the Christ I. These ancient elements exist, but they are not at the center of the mysteries. They accompany the mysteries, so to speak. They must always be experienced starting from the human I awakened by Christ. From the Christ I, if you want to use a single word. From the earthly I that unites with the solar I. From the lower I that unites with the higher I. We can say it in many ways. The fire of sacrifice, which for the kabare still burned outside on the sacrificial altar of the kabare, now no longer burns outside. It burns within the human interior, in the heart that opens to the living apocalypse. If this does not happen, any outward act is empty. It is we who, starting from the fire of sacrifice within the human interior, bring the conscious spirit outside ourselves in word, light, life, and substance. I will give an example. You go to a place. This place would be a sacred place, but you realize from the etheric astral atmosphere that this place has been consumed or possibly even desecrated. Well, it is not a place to be avoided. It is a place to which to bring the renewed spirit in the consciousness soul, in the I that grasps itself in the consciousness soul. Our task today is not to visit places where spirituality still lives in the way of the past, but to bring a new spirituality to places where it no longer exists. It has decayed. This fourth stage of the mysteries can also be called the mystery of Christ. It is the mystery of Golgotha that lives continuously in the inner being of the human being, in the human I awakened by the Christ. And it is precisely the mystery of Golgotha that is at the center of the act of consecration of man, and by extension of all the new mysteries. So the substance is no longer of the outer world, but of the human body that is transmuted, transfigured. The light is no longer seen in the crystal with the ferments, but shines from the heart. And the magic word does not evoke images in smoke, but creates reality in the spirit. The fire of sacrifice of the new era is the fire of spiritual thinking. And I mentioned earlier that Michael's title is Flaming Prince of Thinking. This is why we follow the path of Michael, because it begins with thinking, moves on to feeling, where we mentioned Anel, the archangel of Venus, and then moves on to the wheel with Samael, the archangel of Mars. Steiner also calls it a cognitive love, that is a love that starts from knowledge. Paracelsus, who is already in these forces, will say, "He who knows nothing loves nothing." To truly love it is necessary to know. I cannot truly love what I do not know. This clearly transforms the soul's substance into the light of the consciousness of the I. This is also the solution to what we experience every day, because we live in a world where knowledge, being divorced from the spirit, leads not to love but to hatred. It does not lead to union in love but to division in hatred. So knowledge in itself is the way of love, but it must be a knowledge that takes into account both matter and spirit. If we only know matter, we arrive at division in hatred. Whereas if we know in spirit, we unite in love, which is the Christ, while the other is clearly the Antichrist in its various forms and aspects. So the fourth stage of the new mysteries of Christ redeems all the previous ones and is the Christic synthesis of the entire evolution of the mysteries. So, to summarize, and we come to the conclusion, in the ancient mysteries, the era is the Lemurian, Atlantean, Paleo-Indian, Paleo-Persian. In the relationship between man and God, the gods descend directly. The element, the substance of worship, is cosmic matter that is transmuted by the divine from within, because the divine reveals itself directly. The organ of knowledge is direct vision, and the figure, we can say, the symbol of this is solar fire, perceived as the sun outside of us. In the semi-ancient mysteries, the second stage, we are in the late Persian, Egypto-Chaldean epoch, the third cultural epoch, in the relationship between man and God. The gods send their forces. Their presence has already withdrawn, and luminous ferments remain, that is, the trace of divine forces in the substance that shines with solar light, cosmic light. The organ of knowledge is illumination, the observation of these luminous ferments and the reception of this light internally, and the symbolic figures are crystals that emanate light. In the third stage, the semi-new mysteries, for example, the Greek ones and those of the Kabbalah, and also the early Christian ones, in the fourth cultural epoch, the relationship between man and God is that man ascends to the divine through man's inner self with the Word, first prophetically, before Christ, and then actually in principle after Christ. The element of worship is sacred smoke in which the sound is emitted that takes on an image. The organ of knowledge is the imagination of the word. The symbolic figure is smoke permeated by sound that generates an image, as in the Kabbalah. But the same also happened in early Christianity. Let me give you an example. If you observe the ancient Eastern Christian rites, for example, the Coptic Church, the Armenian Church, the Orthodox Church itself, but if you also observe, for example, the Ambrosian rites, if you go to Milan, you will notice the extensive use of smoke while the words of the rite are pronounced, and the smoke actually takes on forms that it would not normally take because it is permeated by the word. Clearly, I repeat, it is an image still linked to the semi-new mysteries, which, however, if you go to see it, you can go to Milan, to Sant'Ambrogio, go and sit in a mass with the Ambrosian rite, and you will see at the appearance in the church at the moment of the mass of the open gospel, with the bearers of the gospel and these thuribles with these wisps of smoke and the words that are brought, you will see that it is indeed an extremely intense experience that refers precisely to the moment at the turn of the mystery of Golgotha, before and afterwards. Then, in the fourth stage, the new mysteries, which is the time between the end of the fourth and the fifth cultural epoch, ours, the relationship between man and God, the divine, is that Christ acts from within man, starting from the I. So the I, on thinking, feeling, and willing. The element of cult is the new mysteries themselves. In the path of Abel, it is the act of consecration of man. In the midstream, it is the sacrifice made at the altars. The difference is that in the path of Abel, there is only one priest, and this was also true throughout antiquity, and the faithful. Whereas in the path of Cain, everyone becomes gradually a priest, and together in a spiritual community, they relate to the divine. And remember that the Canaanite initiation begins with Lazarus, John the Evangelist, whereas before the resurrection of Lazarus, it was all Abelite. The organ of knowledge of the new mysteries is the knowledge of the heart, also called apocalyptic knowledge. The thinking of the heart that knows. Therefore, knowledge is inextricably linked to love. I love what I know, and I know what I love. However, we must always bear in mind that it must be a knowledge that encompasses both matter and spirit. If there is only matter or only spirit, we obviously tend towards Ahriman, if we know only matter, and towards Lucifer, if we know only spirit, thus turning away from this mystery of Christ in the heart. The symbolic figure is the altar of the human heart. In fact, Steiner, perhaps you have already participated in the so-called Michael meditation, in the fourth meditation of which Michael meditation is composed, the imagination is brought to the altar of the human heart. In reality, it is brought in all four parts, but it appears very clearly in the fourth part, which is the meditation for the eye. In the first part, which is that of thinking, it is said, for example, that the heart is like a shining chalice, and then it is revealed, and there is this altar of the human heart. We thus conclude this journey of the mysteries that undergoes this metamorphosis through substance ferments light that is also life. The word that is then projected into the smoke prepares the new mysteries. New mysteries in which man itself becomes the altar in its own heart, also becoming the substance and the fire of the sacrifice itself. Or the kabara burned physical substances, transmuting them toward burns the eye of the human being who has become self-conscious. Where sacrificial smoke once rose, today spiritual thinking rises. That becomes like a spiritual smoke, a cloud of light that unites earth with the heavens. With this, I thank you, and we have concluded this first meeting. I thank you because I see that you have persevered, only if you had to leave. Having said that, bear in mind that it is a truly intense cycle from a cognitive point of view, but it is something we really need today, because today we need to recover the meaning of cult. Not cult in an ancient form, though that can help us to understand its importance for the history of humanity, but a renewed form of cult that is suited to the consciousness soul, to our current evolution. So thank you, and we will see each other again soon on Friday for the next meeting. All right, Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much.